We are in chapter 5, which is labor costs. We had introduced it, but we can have a recap of what we looked at. There are three elements of costs. When we classify costs by their elements, we had agreed that costs can be classified as materials, labor, and expenses. Costs can be classified as materials, labor, and expenses when we classify costs by elements into materials, labor, and expenses. So we want to focus on the second element of cost, and the second element of cost is labor. Now, what is labor costs? It's basically what is paid to our employees. What is paid to our employees? The salaries and wages paid to employees is what we refer to as labor costs. Therefore, in these salaries and wages paid to employees, when we are analyzing labors, in the context of this chapter, we will look at the following. There are 8 subtopics that we will focus on under the chapter labor. The first area is classification of employees. We will see that employees are classified as either direct employees or indirect employees. In the second area of the chapter, we look at classification of labor costs. We will classify labor costs as either direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. That is the second area in the chapter. The third area in the chapter, we look at what is called overtime. Overtime is basically the extra hours employees work above the standard time set. The extra time employees work above the standard time set. Number 4, we look at accounting for labor costs. Under accounting for labor costs, in this case, it's basically the double entry that is followed when you are accounting for labor. When you want to pay our employees, for example, the money is kept in the bank. So we credit bank and we debit an account called labor account. And then we will see how to analyze it further. The fifth subtopic is remuneration methods. So under remuneration methods, how do we pay our employees? We can pay our employees either using time-based remuneration method or output-based remuneration methods. So when we are remunerating employees, we can either use time-based or output-based remuneration methods. The sixth subtopic is incentive schemes. Under incentive schemes, these are bonuses that are paid to our employees. How do we reward our employees? We pay them in form of, if, for example, an employee does a good job, how do we reward the employees? By paying them bonuses. So these are known as incentive schemes. The seventh area is known as known as labor turnover. What is labor turnover? The rate or the frequency at which employees leave an organization. That is labor turnover. And finally, the eighth area is measurement of labor. How do we measure labor? There are 3 ratios that we will use to measure labor. Production volume ratio, also known as activity ratio, there is efficiency ratio, and there is capacity utilization ratio. So those are the 8 areas, 8 subtopics we will cover under chapter 5 on labor. So let's start with the first one, classification of employees. Now, when we classify employees, we saw last time that employees can be classified as either direct employees or indirect employees. Who are direct employees? Employees involved in the making of a product. If, for example, it's a production company, the employees who are involved in the producing the product, in making the product, or offering a service. For example, what I'm doing is a service. If I'm involved directly into offering this service, in that case, I'm a direct employee. So if it's in a manufacturing company, the employees involved in making the product in the factory, those are direct employees. If it's in a service organization, like what we are doing right now, in this case, what I'm paid for teaching you, in that case, I become a direct employee, employees. Now, on the other hand, when we classify employees as indirect, these are employees who just support the production process. They give support to the production process. For example, in a company, the CEO does not make the product. So the CEO is an indirect employee. The HR, the human resource manager, is not involved in the making of the product. So he's an indirect employee. So take note that when we classify, we can classify as either direct employees can be classified as either direct employees or they can be indirect employees. Either direct employees or they can be indirect employees. Now, how do we pay employees in this chapter, labor? So when we analyze what is paid to employees, we can analyze it into 4 areas or 4 groups. What is given to employees? There is what we call basic pay for standard hours. There is what is known as basic overtime. There is what is known as overtime premium and other forms of allowances and bonuses. We had also looked at this in the last session. Now, I remember I gave an example. If in a day, an employee is normally supposed to work 8 hours, 8 hours. If it's maybe he works from maybe 8 in the morning until 4. How many hours are those? 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. If he's supposed to work from 8 to 4, that means he's supposed to be working 8 hours in a day. That is what we call standard hours the employee is supposed to work. So your contract maybe states that you should be working from 8 to 4 p.m. every day. In that case, those are what we call standard hours. Now, what you are paid for those hours is known as basic pay for standard hours. Now, sometimes employees work more than 8 hours. Your job says, yes, your contract says you should be working until 4 p.m., but maybe you have a lot of work in a particular day and you extend until 6 p.m. Instead of working until 4, you have worked until 6 p.m. Those extra hours you have worked are known as overtime. The extra hours you work are known as overtime. Now, to encourage or to motivate employees to work overtime, the overtime rate should always be higher than the basic rate, than the rate paid for the standard hours. To encourage employees to work overtime, the overtime rate should always be higher. For example, if in the standard hours, an employee was being paid 20,000 per hour, in overtime, employees maybe are being paid 30,000 per hour. So basic pay rate is 20,000 per hour. But if an employee works overtime, he's paid 30,000 per hour. So you divide the 30,000 into 2. There is the 20,000 and there is the extra 10,000 out of the 30,000. That is the 20 out of the 30 is known as basic overtime. The extra 10 is known as overtime premium. And then you can be given any other benefit in the organization. That is number 4, other forms of allowances. Other forms of allowances that an employee can be provided with. Now, let's look at a short example to help us explain the analysis of pay. We had also looked at this. If an employee in a day, an employee is supposed to work 8 hours, you remember the example I've given. is supposed to work maybe from 8 to 4 p.m. That is 8 hours at a basic rate of 1,000. Maybe an employee is paid at a rate of 1,000 per hour for the first 8 hours they work. In a particular day, an employee worked for 10 hours. So instead of working 8 hours, this employee worked 10 hours. So which means he worked 2 hours more than the standard time of 8 hours. So these extra 2 hours he worked are known as overtime. So for the extra hours worked, that is the 2 hours, the employee will be paid 1,500. Remember, in the basic time, the basic standard time, he was being paid 1,000 per hour. But for the extra hours worked, he's being paid 1,500. So required, find the total pay of the employee. So when we analyze number one, basic pay for standard hours, the standard hours were 8 hours. So you take 8 hours times the rate of pay for the standard hours. The rate of pay was 1,000. So if you've been asked, what is the basic pay for standard hours? It will be 8 hours times the basic rate of 1,000. So that gives you a total of 8,000. Now you are asked, what is the basic overtime? Remember, the overtime hours were 2, 10 minus 8. So the overtime hours were 2, and for the overtime period, he was being paid at a rate of 1,500. So remember, the basic rate was 1,000. So the extra amount above the basic is 500. So you divide this 1,500 into 2. There is the 1,000 in 8, and there is the extra 500. So the 1,000 in these, out of these, is known as basic overtime. The extra 500 is known as overtime premium. And the total overtime hours were 10 minus 8, which is 2. So look at this. Basic overtime is 1,000 times 2, and overtime premium is 500 times 2. So when you add 500 plus this 1,000, it gives you 1,500, and it is equal to this. So this is the rate that was paid for the extra 2 hours. So that is what we have there. Now, in this example, there was no bonus paid, or there was no any other extra allowance paid. So other forms of allowances are 0. So if I ask you, what is the gross pay of the employee? You will take 8,000 plus 2,000 plus 1,000 plus 0. So the total pay for the employee will be 8,000 plus 2,000 plus 1,000 plus 0 to give you a total pay of 11,000. So remember, we have said that employees are classified into 2, direct employees or indirect employees. When we are looking at employees' pay, there is the basic pay for standard hours, there is the basic overtime, there is the overtime premium, and there is the other forms of allowances. Next area is classification of labor costs. We have looked at types of employees. Now we need to classify labor costs. Again, in this case, when we are classifying labor costs can be classified as costs. Now is money. Remember, the other time it was types of employees, categories of employees, direct or indirect. Now we are looking at classification of costs, labor costs. Labor costs can be classified as either direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. Let's be extremely attentive in this area. It will affect all the remaining subtopics. This area, classification of labor costs. It will affect all subsequent subtopics on labor. So we are trying to say, remember, our topic is labor costs. So when we are classifying labor costs, it can be classified as either direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. Now, direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. We said we had 2 categories of employees. Let me go back. We had 2 categories of employees. We had direct employees and indirect employees. Remember, we have two categories of employees, direct employees and indirect employees. Now, when we talk of costs, they can either be direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. Now, anything paid to indirect employee, so long as you have evidence proof that this is an indirect employee, an employee who just supports the process, is not directly involved. So anything paid to an indirect employee is classified as indirect labor costs. I hope that's clear. So long as you know there are two employees, there is Joseph and Andrew. Joseph is a direct, Andrew is indirect. Anything paid to Andrew as an indirect employee will be indirect labor costs. So anything paid to indirect employees are classified as indirect labor cost. Again, I'm pleading, let's be very attentive here. There is a point we want to come out with here, a very clear point that will lead us through the next areas. So employees into two, direct and indirect. We have said anything paid to indirect employees is indirect labor costs. Anything paid to indirect employees is indirect labor costs. Now we are trying to say in this case, for the indirect labor costs, anything paid to indirect employees. Now, for direct employees, we have talked, point number one is talking about indirect employees. Now, let's come to direct employees, point number two. For direct employees, now for these direct employees, their pay can be analyzed into, let me go back here. Their pay can be analyzed into basic pay for standard hours, basic overtime, which we have looked at, overtime premium, and other forms of allowances and bonuses. Anything paid for basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, these two, remember I'm now referring to direct employees. For direct employees, the number one, basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, they are direct labor costs. I'm repeating. For direct employees, number one, basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, they are direct labor costs. Basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, there are direct labor costs. Overtime premium and any other allowance are indirect. So when you look at direct employees, basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime are direct labor costs. Overtime premium and other forms of allowances are indirect labor costs. So that is what we are trying to say here. For direct employees, I'm going to read this point. For direct employees, basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime are direct labor costs. For direct employees, overtime premium and other allowances are indirect labor costs. So remember, employees' wages, there is basic pay for standard hours, there is the basic overtime, there is the overtime premium, and there is the allowances. So basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, they are direct labor costs. Overtime premium and other allowances are indirect labor costs. However, the next slide, we have said, I'm repeating, we have said overtime premium, can I just take you back? We have said here, overtime premium we have classified it as indirect. Overtime premium, we have classified it as indirect. However, there are certain cases when overtime premium is classified as direct. I'm repeating. Overtime premium is indirect labor costs. But there are certain circumstances, there are certain conditions when overtime premium is classified as direct labor costs. So the default is overtime premium is indirect, but there are certain conditions when overtime premium is classified as direct. What are those conditions? Number one, when employees work routinely, every day, they just work overtime. If employees overtime working is a routine every day, there is no day they fail to work overtime. In that case, overtime premium will be classified as direct labor costs. That is the first condition. So what is the first condition when overtime premium is classified as direct? Number one, overtime working is routine. And number two, it is the customer who requested the employees to work overtime. For example, a customer brings you a job to do, and you tell the customer, this job will take 2 days to complete it. And then the customer insists that the customer is willing to pay extra, ensure you complete the job in 1 day. In that case, we are saying that it is the customer who requested you to work overtime. So if any of these two conditions is met, overtime premium will be classified as direct. If overtime working is a routine, or it's the customer who requested us to work overtime, in that case, overtime premium will be a direct labor cost. Otherwise, we have said basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, they are direct. Overtime premium and allowances, they are indirect. But there are certain cases when overtime premium is removed from indirect and it is taken to direct. What are the two conditions? Number one, overtime is a routine. Overtime working is a routine. And number two, it's the customer who requested us to work overtime. If it is the customer who requested us to work overtime, in this case, overtime premium will be treated as a direct labor costs. I hope we are clear there. So in that case, I was just trying to classify labor costs. We were trying to classify labor costs. So we have said when we classify labor costs, we classify them as either direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. Anything paid to indirect employees is indirect labor costs. But when we come to direct employees, basic pay for standard hours and basic overtime, they are direct labor costs, and overtime premium and allowances are indirect labor costs. So we have looked at number one, classification of employees. Number two, classification of labor costs. Let us analyze number three, overtime. Now, what have we said about overtime? We have said overtime is the extra hours an employee works. Extra hours an employee works above the basic time. It is called overtime. So take note of this. Overtime is the extra time worked by employees above the basic or standard time. Overtime is paid at a rate higher than the basic rate. You recall the example I gave out. For example, if the basic rate of pay is 1,000, overtime rate may be 1,500. So in that case, overtime is being paid at a rate higher than the basic rate. Now, overtime is divided into two. We had already looked at that, basic overtime and overtime premium. So for the overtime hours, The hours you are paid overtime, if we multiply it by the basic rate, it is overtime, basic overtime. If the extra amount we pay, remember the basic rate in this case is 1,000. The extra amount we pay is 500. So that 500 times the overtime hours, it's called an overtime premium. It's called an overtime premium. So basic overtime is direct labor costs. Basic overtime is direct labor cost. I've already explained that in the previous slide. Overtime premium is indirect labor cost unless the two conditions are met. What are the two conditions? We said overtime working is a routine, and number two, if it's the customer who has requested you to work overtime. So if these two conditions are met, any of these two conditions are met, overtime premium is treated as direct. If these two conditions are not met, overtime premium is treated as indirect. I'm repeating because I know that's important. Overtime premium is indirect. But if these two conditions are met, overtime premium will be direct. So there is a scenario here I've provided. Overtime premium is normally expressed as, you can be told overtime premium is a percentage of the basic rate. Maybe you are being told overtime premium is being paid at a rate of 30% above the basic rate. So if the basic rate is 1,000, the overtime premium, if it's 30%, you calculate 30% of 1,000, which is 300. So 300. Now, I've given an example here. If the overtime premium is 50% of the basic rate of 1,000. So in that case, overtime premium will be 500 if the basic rate is 1,000. Sometimes you are also told overtime is paid at a time and a half, a time and a quarter, a time and a third, etc. If you have been told overtime is being paid at a time and a half, you take the basic rate plus a half of it. I'm repeating. If you've been told overtime premium, overtime is being paid at a time and a half, you take the rate, basic rate, plus a half of the basic rate. A half of 1,000 is 500. So you will take 1,000 plus a half of 1,000, which is 500. So if you have been told overtime is paid at a time and a quarter, you take the basic rate of 1,000 plus a quarter of 1,000, which is 250. So the rate of pay will be 1,250. What is overtime? Overtime is the extra time employees work above the basic rate. Extra time employees work above the basic rate. So we have two examples that we will read, maybe 2 or 3 examples, and then we will go to Excel and try to compute them. So we have looked at number 1, types of employees, classification of employees. We have said employees are classified as either direct or indirect employees. Direct employees, employees involved in the making of a product or offering a service. Indirect employees who support the process. Classification of labor costs, direct labor costs or indirect labor costs. For direct labor cost, everything paid to indirect employees is indirect labor costs. For the direct employees, basic pay for standard hours in basic overtime is direct labor costs. Overtime premium and allowances are indirect labor costs. So let's look at these 2 examples, and then we will go and solve them in Excel. So the question reads, Vienna is a direct labor employee who works a standard 35 hours per week and is paid at a basic rate of £12 per hour. Overtime is paid at a time and a third. In a particular week, she worked 42 hours and received a bonus of 50. Calculate, number 1, basic pay for standard hours. Number 2, basic pay for overtime hours. Number 3, overtime premium. And number 4, classify as direct and indirect labor costs. So these are a couple of examples that will lead us to calculations of the basic pay of employee, the overtime premium, the basic overtime, and any allowances. So let's take a short break, and in the next session, we will look at that. Let me just take a short break in this.